Hi everyone. In this chapter, we dive into the topics of organisational structure and culture. And in this first video, we're going to be having a look at the 6 key elements of organisational design. So the factors that go into how we actually set up the structure of our organisation. And I want to kick us off with having a quick look at some different organisational structures from the music industry, just so we can kind of contextualise this content, because it does get, as usual, pretty bogged down in the terminology. So I just want to just kick us off with, here's an example of a typical record company structure. I know it's a little bit blurry, but you can see here that we've got these sort of different departments. So kicking off at the top with the kind of executive structure, which is where you'll have your CEO and the board and maybe some of the key executives in the record company. You've then got each of your different labels. So you might have different indie labels, different mainstream labels, then classical, and some catalog, so back catalog sort of stuff. Then administration, which might include the accounting and all the kind of royalty kind of parts of the business, the sales and distribution components, marketing department, then international, so that covers all the international distribution rights, all that sort of stuff, merchandising department, and a publishing department. Similar sort of presentation of this is shown here in this slide, just slightly different formatting depending on the actual organisation. I think this might be the structure for BMG from my recollection, and sets out, a slightly different way of, let's say, drawing the hierarchy, depending on how they've organised their business. So some other examples here are the mushroom group, so a bit closer to home. And what we see here that's a bit different is that this is more of a conglomeration of different companies that sit under the mushroom umbrella, and then operate almost as their own independent entities. So we've got all these different record labels, different parts of their live business. And so you can imagine how the labels and the live work together for all the kind of touring and live shows that they do. They've got their publishing company, their booking agencies, which, obviously would work very closely with their live divisions. Then their artist management, which obviously would work with the labels and across the live, etc., etc. And then they've got all these other spin-off companies that represent different types of organizations that, again, sit within that mushroom group conglomerate. And then within each of these companies, they're going to have their own organizational structure. So the harbour agency is obviously going to be comprised of someone who heads up that team, various booking agents, and then they may or may not have their own sort of admin department that does their accounts and all that sort of stuff. Or they may have, I'm not sure, but they may also have departments like that, administrative type stuff, that sits across either all or multiples of these companies to get that sort of economies of scale that comes with being able to have those kinds of functions consolidated across multiple different entities. The other one that I'll show you is the Secret Service Group. So this is headed up by Paul Petico, who you might know as half with Jess DeCrow of the Splendour in the Grass festival. And you can see here, so Paul's also well known as being the manager of Powderfinger. And then he's got all these different companies that sit under his Secret Service umbrella company. So similar to the Mushroom Group, he's got the Secret Service Group with all these different companies that sit underneath that. As you can see, Splendour, so different festivals, record labels, music services, and then he's also got interest in a couple of bars and restaurants. And then if we just dive into this component here, which is their public relations division, what you see here is that this is a company that was created by Paul in partnership with Stacey Piggott. So you can see here that he's got this strategy of finding good people and working with them, and then bringing those companies in under this umbrella. And you can see here that this company, so the Secret Service PR, has got 5 publicists. So again, whether they have their own admin in terms of accounting, you know, receptionist, that sort of stuff, or whether that's shared, I don't know, but that could be a way that they do that. All right, so let's now dive into the theory part of it. Now that we've got a bit of a sense about what do we mean by organisational structure and design, and then what does it mean from a sort of technical and theoretical perspective. So let's kick off. So our book, and I'm just going to try and get through this as quick as possible because, like I said, it gets pretty bogged down in terminology. And in a lot of cases, you're not going to encounter to a really deep degree some of this stuff. The music and the creative industries tend to be quite, as we'll get to, more organic in style rather than very hierarchical. So let's dive into each of these 6 aspects that are parts that kind of go into thinking about how an organisation will be structured, why it will be structured that way, and some of the pros and cons associated with those different structural elements. And so what I want you to kind of take away from this is not so much about all the detail about what each of these specific terms mean and why should I care, but when you kind of enter an organisation, either you might be working for an organisation as employee, or you might work with an organisation as a contractor or as a client, or with them, or you as a client to them. You might be working in some kind of partnership arrangement. Being able to kind of understand how does this organisation work in terms of the way that the organisation is structured, and what might that mean in terms of either how I work with them or navigating my way through the organisation, and then what might be some of the sort of limitations that they might hit as a consequence of the way they're structured, and some of the efficiencies that might come from it as well. All right, so let's dive into the first one, which is the work specialisation. So this is where we actually divide labour into separate tasks, right? So you've probably all heard of division of labour. You know, we might think of this as on a production line. You know, you have somebody who's in charge of putting, you know, like say it's building a car, someone's in charge of putting in the windscreens all day, and someone else is in charge of putting on the axles or whatever it is. You might think of this as well in say like a hospital. You have different specializations of, you know, surgeons, and then gastroenterologists, and then you know, different specializations of medicine. And so the idea here is that by having specialization of tasks, we can understand, first of all, who's doing what and what their scope of responsibility is. But also it enables the organization to be more efficient, because people aren't kind of trying to do a bit of everything and then swapping tasks and kind of getting all mixed up. They're kind of focused on the particular aspect of something that they do well. And as a consequence of that, they can develop that skill set and get particularly good at it. And so, you know, again, if we're thinking about this very kind of corporate and like manufacturing type industry, which is what the book tends to sort of lean itself to, you can imagine that if you've got people, you know, all day doing something over and over and over again, that repetition is one, going to help them get very skilled at that, and stop them wasting time, shifting tasks, getting new materials, getting new machinery, and that sort of stuff. So you'll get more efficiency and a high set of skills. But what will then happen is, and we'll see this in the next slide, we get this kind of curve where we sort of start off by the more specialized and efficient we get, it sort of peaks out. And then what happens is that people start to get really bored. And so again, if we think of that machinery production line idea, you can imagine if you're doing the same thing just repetitively all day, every day, you're going to get bored, you're going to get tired because you're bored. You're probably going to get stressed because you just kind of, your head will just start to kind of go elsewhere. And your productivity is going to go down. And so then you're going to start taking time off work. And so in the creative industries, this isn't so much of a challenge. It probably is more the case in something like, you know, manufacturing. So, you know, old days of CD manufacture, or people who work in, say, I can imagine jobs like digital management, you know, where you're just uploading songs all day and putting in keywords, or possibly if you're doing SEO type stuff, that could become quite mundane. And so what this picture is trying to illustrate for us here, in terms of the work specialization across the bottom, this is low, so that means that people are not very specialized, so they're just trying to do everything. And so this is often the case if you're a solopreneur, you've got your own business, you're trying to do your own thing, you have to do everything, right? So you're doing everything from being the CEO to being the janitor, you're trying to do the accounts, you're trying to do everything. And so your level of specialization is low, which can result in a fairly low productivity because you're trying to do all those different jobs and juggle everything, and you're not building up your skill set. And then as you start to get more specialized, so perhaps you start to be able to get someone to do the accounts, maybe you can bring someone on board to do an aspect of the job that you're not particularly interested in or particularly good at. And then you start to increase your productivity, which is what this this vertical axis is, because you're getting better at it and more efficient at it. But then as we see, it peaks out, right? So at a certain point, you stop learning and growing because you've maxed out your ability to do that job well. You kind of just, now you're just coasting. You can kind of just go, oh, yeah, whatever. And then you start to get inefficient again because you have become so specialized and so good at what you're doing that it just becomes boring. And so knowing how to navigate this curve over your career, and then as a manager, knowing how to manage this for the people that you're working with. So keeping that balance between how specialized they are and it not becoming routine and boring, but also that they're not constantly sitting down here where they're just trying to do too many things that they aren't quite that good at, or juggling too many hats. So hopefully that's been useful in terms of understanding this idea about work specialization. So our next element is departmentalization. So this is when we think about how the jobs are grouped together in an organization. So again, in that record company example, we saw that, you know, different labels are grouped together. So you might think of them as different departments within the record company. You would have all the admin grouped together. And so you then have these different departments that sit within the organization. And so in terms of departmentalization, there's these 5 different ways that we can structure our organization in terms of different departments. What we would see most often would be functional. So the example that I just talked about in a record company, where you've got your admin department, your different record labels departments, you've got your distribution department, your marketing department, etc., etc. Other ways of doing it might be a product department. So again, you might think of like often, so like Maya would have different product-based departments within their store potentially. So they would have their team that looks after women's wear, menswear, children's stuff, kitchenware, etc., etc. And then people have their expertise and their specialization based on those different product lines. A customer example might be, as they've indicated here, where you've got different departments servicing different types of customers. So for example, I'm just trying to think of an example in the music industry and I'm failing, but you might get this, for example, if you've got an organization that has a retail component where they're dealing with with people, right? So say like a telco might, you know, they might have their department that deals with with consumers, so households. And so when you go, say, onto the Telstra site, they've got a, you know, are you a retail customer? Are you a household or residential? Or are you a business or a government customer? And so they would then have different departments that have specialized in dealing with residential customers, with business customers, and then they might have a kind of government one as well. You might also have different departments based on geography. So this might be the case in in a big international organization where they might have different regions. So they might have an Asia Pacific department that services, you know, customers in that geography, and people are based in that geography as well. Then they might have European division, etc., etc. And then process. So this might be where you've got different types of work. So might be kind of similar to functional, where you've got your, you know, your accounting team, your marketing team, that sort of stuff. But if you think of it in terms of, you might remember back in entrepreneurship where we looked at the workflow of where we acquire our customers, how do we engage with them, then how do we sell to them, then how do we service and manage them, etc., etc. So different parts of that customer experience might deal with different parts of the organization and different departments within the organization. So then we move on to our third area, which is what we term authority and responsibility. And these two terms you might think of as different sides of the same coin. So authority is the rights that become inherent to you. So the authority that is given to you by virtue of your position in the organization. And so as the manager that has that authority, then you are given those rights to kind of say to people, oh, look, can you do this or this or this? And then responsibility is the flip side of that, which is that whoever has authority over you, you essentially have an obligation to perform those duties as a result of their authority. So again, this tends to be a little bit blurred in the creative industries. You know, we're kind of, depending on the type of organization that you're working for, this may or may not be quite, be really rigid and in this very kind of command and obey kind of way. It might be a little bit more fluid than that, but the kind of concept is still important that, you know, if you have authority, there's a sense of you have the ability to make decisions and have people actually perform those decisions as a consequence of the authority that is inherited by you. And so we have these different types of authority. Again, a lot of terminology, but line authority just means that if somebody's working for you, you have that line, you know, that kind of, you can say, oh, can you do this please? And it's kind of understood that they should do it. So you can kind of think of that in terms of this idea of chain of command. So if somebody has line authority over you in a chain of command, you kind of have to do what they say to a certain extent. And then staff authority gives you the ability to request and direct people that you don't necessarily have direct line of chain of command over. So an example of this is that if you are, say, the marketing manager in an organization, you'll have staff authority to, say, direct the accounts department to pay a bill. And so there's an implied authority to direct that department to do something as a consequence of your role. And so this is a bit of an illustration of the idea of chain of command. I'm sure that's fairly intuitive and obvious to you. And I'm sure you've all been in work where you've had that experience of having a line manager who's the one that you report to and can help you either solve problems or request things of you. And so this is then an illustration of the idea of line of authority. So the dotted line suggesting where you don't have that direct line of authority, but you have the authority to make requests, even though that person doesn't report directly to you. And so then the other concept that goes along with the idea of authority is the concept of power. And power is, we refer to, is your ability or your capacity to influence decisions. So we can think of this in terms of as a larger concept that sits within authority, but power can have a broader reach than authority, right? So authority is tied to your particular role or position, whereas power is a bit more about influence and your ability to affect decisions within an organisation or anywhere really. And so we have these 5 different types of power that we can think of. So coercive power, if you can think of, you know, just as the name suggests, being able to kind of force or coerce somebody to do something, which is power where it's based on fear. So, you know, if we've got a really nasty boss who, you know, threatens us to, I'm going to sack you if you don't do that, we might think of that as coercive power because they're holding something over us in some kind of threat. Reward power is the ability to give something to someone that they want. And so, you know, we might use this with kids where we say, all right, if you go and do your homework, I'll give you some ice cream. In a workplace, we might say, you know, if you, things like encouragement awards or, you know, kind of employee of the week type things, is the power to influence people's behavior by giving them some kind of reward or something that they would value. And that might be that they, you know, prestige, or that they get a thank you, you know, it can be as small as that, is a kind of using reward as a source of power. Legitimate power is based on the hierarchy of the organisation, so it's tied a bit more to authority. And so the idea that you're using your power legitimately if you have that invested power from the authority component. Illegitimate power would be where you kind of would be trying to kind of get someone to do something, but you don't actually have the authority to do it. And sometimes you see this in organizations where you get sort of little dictators who want to go around and call the shots, and they don't actually have the authority tied to it, and the responsibility that goes along with that as well. Then expert power is where you've got power based on your particular expertise. And so this might come with experience, where, you know, people might come to you for advice because you know something. And so that gives you a level of power to affect their decision making because they're coming to you on the basis of that knowledge that you hold. So this is the case, you know, in particular, as you build experience in an organization, you grow up in the hierarchy because of that expert power that you're developing, which is giving you the ability to make more impact on the decisions that are being made in the organization. And then referent power is the idea of power that comes with something that's about either resources that you have or something about you. So we can think of celebrity as being a really good example. The idea of being an influencer, like a social media influencer, is based on the idea of referent power. And, you know, the very heart of the idea of being an influencer is that companies would come to you because you have the ability to influence, i.e. you have that referent power to affect people's purchasing decisions. So, you know, if I'm a super wellness influencer, then a company might come and say, hey, can you tell your followers about our products and say it's really great? And then because you think that I'm really knowledgeable, or you just think I'm hot or something, you're going to be more likely to buy that product based on my referent power. So our fourth component, when we're thinking about things that affect and go into how we might structure our organizations, is what we call the span of control. So this is essentially the number of people that as a manager you can supervise. And this kind of gets impacted by a range of factors, right? So if you think about you as a manager or an organization that you've worked for, or just any organization you're familiar with, if you think of a person who's a manager and you think of the number of people that report to that person, it can vary in terms of the number of people, and also what those people are doing. And so something like a McDonald's, because the procedures that are they're quite embedded in a McDonald's kind of franchise. Everything's quite procedural. People don't have to be very skilled or have a lot of experience to do that work. You can have a manager overseeing quite a large number of people, because people can kind of get good at what they're doing fairly quickly because of the training and development that they do, and then the procedures that actually take place in that store. And that, in particular, companies like McDonald's that have invested heavily in procedures and in having good production processes, enables that span of control to be expanded. Whereas in the creative industries, where it's quite complex, so you can see here task complexity being one of the factors that affects span of control. If you're a manager and you're working with, say, a small team that are all doing quite different things and the tasks are quite complex, then as a manager, you're going to need to be much more involved in the work that they're doing and helping them with that work. So the number of people that you can actually manage becomes fewer. In addition, the actual expertise and experience, depending again on the complexity of the task. So, you know, if you're working with, say, if you're a hospital manager, you might have people who are very expert. You know, you've got people who are surgeons, and so they've got very deep expertise in what they're doing, but you might be doing quite complex tasks. So you might be bringing a surgery team together that all have a lot of expertise and experience, but the task they're doing is quite complex. And so that might mean that your span of control can't be quite as big as if your staff were expert, but the complexity of the task was quite simple. Physical proximity obviously is going to play a role as well. So if you've got people all in one location, it's going to be much easier to manage that team than if people are all kind of all over the place. And so if you're working with an international team, or potentially if you're working with a lot of outsourced people, the complexity of that work will increase, and so your span of control will shrink a little bit. And then we have just general factors like information management, right? So how easy is it for people in the team to access information, to be able to kind of keep going on their own, or do they have to keep coming back to you as a manager to kind of get more information and keep going? The actual organisation and values and culture. So, you know, is the organisation very much about command and control, and you do what the manager says, and so then the manager has to be on top of it all the time? Or is it fairly loose and people are able to make decisions on their own and then not necessarily have to come back to the manager? Or is there a more kind of collegial group decision making, which then means that the manager isn't the one kind of constantly having to call the shots as such? And then the actual manager's style as well, right? So we have some people who like to micromanage, and others who are quite laissez-faire and are kind of like, off you go, you're on your own. And so you know, obviously if you're on your own, their span of control, their team can be bigger because everyone's just off doing their own thing and they're just kind of troubleshooting or whatever, maybe just playing golf. But if they're a micromanager, then they're probably going to need to have a smaller team because they're going to be, you know, on top of every little detail. So our fifth one is the idea of how centralized or decentralized our organization is going to be designed. So we can think of this in terms of how hierarchical and how we might think of it as top down the organization is set up to be and how it works. So a centralized organization is one where we looked at last week, where the decision making all takes place in the upper management. So it's all at the CEO and senior management levels, and then the information kind of just strips down, and there's a lot of control over who makes decisions. Whereas a decentralized structure means that lower level managers have a lot more say in terms of having those decisions made. And so we can think of the distribution of decision making either being very clustered at the top or being spread out across the organization. And so depending on how that works in the organization, we'll have a different approach and a different structure. And so then our last component is how formal the organisation is. And this doesn't mean like, you know, whether people wear suits or hoodies, it's not that kind of formal, but it's more about how much rules and procedures are guiding the way the organisation is run. So like I just said before about McDonald's, where you have a lot of structure, you know, information on how to make a particular burger will come from head office, and then people just follow that procedure. And so that's highly formalized, as opposed to more creative industries where there'll probably be very little formalization, because each task or each project is going to be made in what we call bespoke, which is that it's just going to be tailored to that particular project. And so we would call that a very informal structure, which means that we have less ability to actually control what is being done at each step of the process and by each individual in the organisation. So another example of formalisation is organisations that are heavily regulated. So if you think of something like the airline industry, where they have very strict rules about, you know, how to fly planes and all the safety standards that go along with that, there's going to be a lot of rules and procedures that go into helping achieve those safety standards. In a similar way, hospitals, you know, anything that's kind of got high risk associated with health and safety, are going to be guided by a lot of rules and procedures, because that's how you get those high standards of safety. Whereas in organisations that are either less risky in terms of people's lives, but also more creative, and also industries that are more what we call volatile, which we've talked about before, and so there's less stability in the industry. Formalization is not going to necessarily be as strong, and that's obviously going to affect how the organization is designed, because you're going to have less requirements around how the work is going to be done. So that's our 6 design elements, hopefully pretty rapid fire. And in our next one, we're going to dig into, I forgot what our next bit is. It is, flicking through the book, factors that actually affect those different structural choices, right? So this is not only about how the organisation is structured, but some of the things that actually then influence those structures as well.